In the enamel sink of the back kitchen, greasy warm water rippled with sickly white foam. Eloise's hands were submerged in it, mechanically scrubbing a stack of heavy ceramic plates. Beyond the window the sky was lead gray, the same as it had been for weeks. The only difference was that just before dawn today the far horizon had briefly burned red, then gone out as quickly as it came, leaving behind a heavier kind of silence. Her fingertip caught on a chip, not a fresh knock, but one worn smooth by repeated washing and years of use. She rubbed it absently, as if she could sand the memory out of the porcelain. The feel of that chip was like a key turning in a locked drawer of memory. Not about plates, but about another kind of break, the deep vehicle ruts hidden at the edge of the woods east of town, half covered by pine boughs and winter's dead grass, and the fear in Pilot Peterson's clouded eyes, and the word he had forced out with his last strength camouflage netting. That image sat heavy in her stomach now, heavier than all the dirty dishes in her hands combined. The information existed, the danger was real, and she had nowhere to put it. From the front room came the sound of boots on floorboards and coarse laughter in German. At this hour every day, a small squad of soldiers on rotation break came in, trading ration coupons for a cup of ersatz coffee and a brief pocket of warmth. Eloise had to go out. She dried her hands, straightened her apron, and lifted a tray. The instant she pushed through the curtain, air hit her face. Tobacco, wet wool, and a cold, steely scent. Familiar faces that were also strangers. She lowered her eyes and set the cups down with practiced steadiness, making herself a piece of furniture. Her gaze skimmed the windowsill. A young soldier stood there, with his back to the room, leaning into the frame as he smoked. Snow dusted the shoulder tabs of his gray-blue greatcoat. He was not an accident, but part of the routine. The surveillance was casual, yet everywhere like air. The Café was one of the few places still operating in this neighborhood, which made it a kind of information exchange, even if only for rumors. The Germans understood that. Eloise understood that they understood. She retreated behind the curtain with the empty tray and returned to the kitchen as if escaping an invisible pressure. Dusk, like ink diluted with water, seeped into the lanes of Bastogne. The most exhausting and also the safest ritual of the day was about to begin. Eloise swept scraps from everywhere, breadcrumbs, potato peels frozen stiff, a smear of grease, into a tin bucket, then added the oily, warm dishwater. The slop bucket was heavy, stinking sour. She pulled on a thick, worn coat, wrapped her headscarf tight, and lifted the bucket toward the back door. The soldier at the window moved and followed her, as always. The alley was narrow, brick walls on both sides, opening at the end onto a slightly wider street. The collection point sat in a recessed corner just past the turn. Snow had been trampled into gray-black mud. The soldier followed a few paces behind. His boots squeaked in the slush. He did not look at her and seemed bored by the errand. Eloise walked steadily. The bucket's weight cut into her fingers. At the collection point stood a half-man tall metal container, its lid propped open, already half filled with refuse. She stepped forward and poured. The foul liquid slid down with a thick, obscene sound. The soldier, as usual, turned his face away with reflexive disgust, lifting his collar as if the smell could be blocked by cloth. It was only a few seconds. Eloise's eyes snapped to the diagonal opposite side of the collection point toward ruins that blended almost perfectly into the wall. There had once been a small courtyard there. Now only a few broken sections of wall remained. In the shadow of brick and rotted wood, she could just make out a low, crooked brick structure, a pre-war rabbit hutch built by residents, long abandoned, half collapsed, buried under broken tiles and snow. A corner no one cared about, a coordinate nearly carved into her childhood memory. Her heart hammered, not with fear, but with the jolt of a sudden, almost painful inspiration. Her brother's voice rose in her mind without warning, so clear it seemed to brush her ear. The most dangerous place is often the safest, Elle. Remember the game we played as kids? We hid the prettiest glass marbles in the deepest spot of that row of old rabbit hutches, the third brick crack from the left. If one day we got separated and needed to leave a sign only the other could understand, we'd use broken china. No one looks for treasure in trash. Back then she had laughed, thinking it was only another wild fantasy between siblings. Now in front of this filthy, frozen collection point, with the soldier's match flare behind her, the childish rules fell away and revealed a sharp, practical core: broken china, trash, rabbit hutch. A forgotten ruin, a route she had to walk every day, a monitored chore so dull it made the watcher numb. The soldier drew on his cigarette and exhaled a cloud of white, still turned partly away, watching the alley mouth. Eloise snapped her gaze back to the bucket's inner wall, where a few cabbage leaves and gray paste still clung. No, not from here. The source of broken china was in the café, in the plates and cups used every day, chipped and cracked until they finally broke. Shards with sharp edges and distinctive flaws were supposed to be tossed into a dedicated crockery bin. Sometimes local kids picked pieces up to play with. Eventually they were hauled away and buried. They were the most invisible kind of garbage. She lifted the empty bucket and turned. The soldier turned too, gesturing for her to head back. On the return walk, every step landed on a newly tightened string inside her. A plan formed like a current under ice. She needed a confirmation signal, a direction, a description of the target's nature. 3 shards, 3 days, 1 drop a day, using this dust garbage run, watched, yet so repetitive it dulled the watcher, as a one-way dead drop requiring no contact. If discovered, she could argue it was nothing: a nervous girl dropping trash, a fragment slipping from a pocket, an accident. The danger was still there, but now it had edges she could measure. Now she had a place to put the information, even if it was only a crack in a ruined rabbit hutch. Back in the cafe's dim, warm kitchen, the noise from the front room was muted behind the curtain. Eloise did not light a lamp. By the last of the gray daylight, she crossed to the old wooden crate reserved for damaged tableware. Inside lay a disorderly heap: a cup with a fracture, a bowl with a bite missing, plates split into wedges. She crouched and sifted among the cold pieces, her fingertips moving as if over a cipher keyboard. The first piece she chose carefully. It was about the size of half her palm, irregular at the edge, but the curve showed it had been part of a plate rim. Most important, it carried a clear hand painted blue cornflower motif. Even broken, the blue remained vivid. Blue pattern meant confirmation. The information she had learned was real. She set it aside. Next she found a nearly pure white fragment with a peculiar shape, narrow and sharp at one end, broader at the other, like a crude stone arrowhead. White arrow, direction, pointing east toward the woods on the eastern edge of town. Finally, at the bottom of the crate, her hand closed on a particularly heavy piece. The porcelain was thick and coarse, a dim off-white with a small curve like the base of a large soup tureen or stew pot. Heavy, darker base. It meant solid, weighty, hard to move. It meant target, heavy equipment, or a fixed position. 3 fragments lay quiet in her palm, catching a faint glimmer in the dusk. They were no longer trash, but 3 cipher units carrying lethal meaning. Selecting them, hiding them, delivering them, each step would be walking a knife edge. Yet what roiled inside Eloise was not fear, but a strange calm. She had found an exit at last, a thread so thin it was almost imaginary, yet real, the thread connecting her to her vanished brother, to Peterson's dying warning, to the blurred fate of this city. The action she could take was small, almost absurd, beside the scale of armies, but it was an action. It was the first time in months she had felt herself move against the occupation. Instead of merely being moved, She wrapped the 3 shards separately in an old rag. The blue one she tucked behind an inconspicuous patch in the lining of her coat. The other 2 she hid under the crate's bottom layer among smaller chips. Tomorrow she would take the white arrow, the day after the heavy base shard. Outside, full darkness fell. The soldiers had left, the cafe closed. The owner muttered as he locked the front door and pocketed the key. Eloise swept the last crumbs, then blew out the candle. In her narrow upstairs room she could hear distant artillery like muffled thunder, the front line grinding somewhere. Nearby there was only the occasional orderly weight of patrol boots passing in the street. Her hand rested lightly on the patch inside her coat. Through the cloth she could feel the hard outline underneath, cold and sharp, and yet the only ember she had. Tomorrow at dusk, when that soldier lit his cigarette behind her again and the slop bucket made its stinking pour, she would cast the first signal. A lonely ritual with an outcome no one could predict was about to begin. The first day's sky was a murky yellow-gray with a rust tint. When Eloise woke, her fingertips touched the small cloth bundle she had hidden under her pillow, the blue-patterned shard. Confirmation. All day it felt like a burning coal pressed against her ribs. Her movements had to be perfectly ordinary. During breakfast hours she served the few locals still allowed out and the soldiers changing shifts. Under the cafe's weak gaslight their faces looked blurred and exhausted. She washed stacked cups and saucers, dried them, set them back, all with the same rhythm as before, as if routine itself were a disguise she could wrap around her body. In the afternoon, under the pretext of sorting the storeroom, she checked the old wooden crate again. The arrow-shaped white shard and the heavy base piece were still hidden beneath the chips. She covered the crate fast, as if nothing had happened. Time crawled with a sticky, stretched texture. Every minute was filled with silent inspection. Had she looked too long toward the back alley? Had she acted oddly around the young soldier who watched her? Was her breathing steady? The smallest mistake could turn her into a person of interest, and in occupied Bastogne, a person of interest did not last long. Dusk finally came. The slop bucket was filled to 7/10, sour rot spreading through the cramped kitchen. Eloise took a deep breath. The stench shot up into her head and made her clearer. She put on her coat, slid her hand into the lining, and confirmed the bundle's position one last time. Her fingers touched the shard's cold edge and the raised paint texture. She lifted the bucket and pushed the door open. Cold air cut her face like a blade. The young soldier was waiting, leaning on the wall, kicking at the snow with his boot in bored irritation. When he saw her, he straightened, yawned, and followed. He seemed in a worse mood today, muttering complaints about the freezing weather and this pointless duty. Eloise kept her eyes down, fixed on the muddy path, one step ahead. Her pace matched yesterday and matched countless yesterdays. The bucket's handle bit into her palm. The pain was real and specific, anchoring her to the moment. She reached the collection point. The metal container gaped like a black mouth. She stepped forward, heaved the bucket, and poured. The thick, obscene sound. As usual, the soldier turned his head away. This time he did not light a cigarette at once. Instead, he stared toward the alley mouth, as if something distant had pulled his attention. A truck passing, a blurred shout. The opening was brief. Eloise's heart clenched. She could not hesitate. Her left hand still held the empty bucket, wobbling slightly, while her right hand flashed into the coat lining and found the small cloth bundle. Her fingers flicked the corner open, revealing the blue cornflower pattern. The movement was tiny, only her wrist. The shard traced a low arc and flew soundlessly into the ruin across the way, vanishing with precision into the shadowed crack of the collapsed rabbit hutch. It made no sharp clink. It simply disappeared into blackness as if it had never existed. The soldier's head turned back. His eyes swept over her and the empty bucket. Eloise was setting the bucket down, flexing her fingers as though they were stiff from cold and weight. Her face showed nothing but wind-reddened skin. The soldier frowned, probably finding her and the chore equally dull, and pulled a cigarette case from his pocket. "Go," he said, and started walking. On the return, each step fell into a kind of drained calm. Her pounding heart began to settle, but something deeper rose in its place. The signal had been sent. It lay alone now in a damp, black crack, like a seed no one might ever find. Would anyone see it, one of her brother's comrades, anyone who knew the rules of that childhood game? Or would snow cover it, mud bury it until it became indistinguishable from real trash? Doubt, cold as floodwater, began to wash over her first resolve, but she did not turn back. The throw could not be unthrown. Second day. The arrow-shaped white shard lay against her skin. Ice rain fell, fine and cruel, stinging her face. The surveillance soldier was different, older, sallow, tight-lipped, barely glancing at her. That made the pressure worse because she could not predict what he noticed. The pouring was almost the same. The ice rain blurred everything. While Eloise poured, the soldier lifted his collar high and turned his body against the wind. For 1 or 2 seconds, that was all. The white arrow shard slid from her fingers into the same shadow. It was even more inconspicuous than the blue piece, like a bit of wall skin that had flaked off by accident. Task completed. Anxiety, however, fermented. Now 2 shards faced each other in the dark. If the first was not understood, the second meant nothing. And if someone found them, but not the right someone, then what? She forced herself to stop imagining. Third day. The last piece, heavy and dark, sat in her pocket like a small grave marker. The weather cleared, but the cold worsened. Her breath steamed. The surveillance soldier was again the young man from the first day. He looked frozen through, stomping and rubbing his hands. Eloise's nerves were stretched to their limit. This was the final piece of the sequence and the highest point of accumulated risk. 3 days in a row, the same woman, the same time, the same motion. The Germans might be slow, but they were not incapable of thought. Any pattern of oddness could draw notice. She lifted the bucket and felt her arm muscles tremble, not from weakness, but from nerve strain. She reached the collection point. The soldier, eager for warmth, struck a match almost as soon as she started pouring and took his first drag greedily. Smoke curled in front of his face. Eloise poured more slowly than the previous days, as if the bucket were especially heavy. With the corner of her vision, she locked onto the shadow. Now! Her wrist moved. The dark shard left her fingers. At that exact instant, the soldier coughed and turned his head toward her. Eloise's blood nearly froze. Her right hand still held a slight outward position, but her fingers were empty. The shard should already have dropped into the crack. The soldier's gaze swept over her hand, over her face, then toward the ruin. In his eyes was a blankness born of cold and boredom. Had he seen something? Maybe nothing. Maybe only her movement looked a fraction stiff. He muttered something, likely a complaint about the miserable weather, and turned back to his cigarette. The danger seemed to pass by a hair. Only when Eloise returned to the cafe's back door did cold sweat slide slowly down her spine. The last shard was out. The sequence was complete. Confirmation, direction, nature. A full, silent warning now lay in the ruins at the end of an alley in Bastogne. Yet the moment the delivery finished, a vast hollowness crashed down. The next step that had sustained her vanished. There were no more shards to choose, no more drops to plan. All her agency ended the moment she released the third piece. What remained was waiting, a new and more torturous state. Before, the risk was concrete, the instant of discovery. Now the risk was abstract and pervasive, endless non-reception. She worked as always, washing cups and plates that never ended, emptying the day's slops. The surveillance soldier still followed, but now she dropped only real garbage. Each time she passed the rabbit hutch ruin, she did not dare look, as if it were a black hole that could drain all her courage. She began watching every unfamiliar face entering the cafe, listening to every blurred bit of talk, trying to catch a hint tied to the woods, tire ruts, camouflage netting, or an explosion. But there was nothing. Only the usual complaints, the dull greetings, and the soldiers' identical chatter. Days passed. The distant artillery sometimes thickened and sometimes thinned. The front line, like a breathing beast, rolled in the wind and snow. Then the news came. Bastogne was surrounded. Panic spread like a fever in the eyes of the few people still on the streets. The cafe's rations tightened further. The ersatz coffee tasted even more suspect. Eloise felt her senses sharpened by extreme anxiety and numbed at the same time. She could hear her own heartbeat in night silence, yet react with almost no feeling to nearby blasts shaking the ground. The signal she had sent became a cold, silent knot inside her. It brought no feedback, good or bad. It simply existed, like an abandoned riddle. The greatest fear clarified, not arrest, but meaninglessness. Peterson might have died for nothing. Her brother's trust might have been misplaced. All her courage and careful calculation might have been a one-woman play performed in a corner no one watched. That shadow of possible futility was more suffocating than the Gestapo's cells. It devoured every quiet moment. At night she lay awake, staring at the low ceiling, wondering whether she had been driven by hallucination and lonely bravery into doing something pitiful and absurd before the scale of war. She held the thread, but she did not know whether the other end was tied to anything at all. Waiting built like thickening ice around Eloise. During the days of encirclement, time lost its line and became a series of loops of hunger, cold, and uncertainty. The cafe opened and closed, depending on whether they could secure even a scrap of ration. German soldiers' faces cycled, their early arrogance stained by growing agitation and fatigue. The young soldier who had watched her take out the trash disappeared, sent to the front perhaps, or dead somewhere she would never know. The alley collection point was cleared only every few days, and the stench grew worse. Eloise still went to dump garbage, if there was any to dump. Each time she passed the ruins, she used all her willpower not to look toward the rabbit hutch. It held all her hope and might also hold the proof of emptiness. Her life looked like any other civilian's struggle to survive. Only she knew that inside a part of her had turned to wasteland, waiting for an echo that might never come. And yet beyond Eloise's perception, in a parallel world she could not see, the three porcelain shards did not sleep entirely. Jean Noel, a man in his 50s with a slight stoop, pushed a broken handcart that squeaked with every step through Bastogne's streets. The cart carried flattened cardboard, empty bottles, rusted tin, sometimes a broken chair. In the German occupation registry, he was a legal junk dealer with papers and taxes paid. To the few who understood, he was an extremely peripheral eye for the resistance. So far out he was almost dormant. His assignment was simple. At intervals, check a few pre-war agreed places that looked meaningless and watch for abnormal trash. Among them were several half-collapsed rabbit hutches in the old quarter. They were part of an emergency contact scheme set long ago, known by very few and never expected to be used. Jean Noel did not fully know whom he served. He only knew that sometimes a stranger came to take his special scrap and left a small payment. He did the work out of habit and out of a thin, stubborn sense of participating against occupation. On the fourth day after Eloise dropped the third shard, Jean Noel followed his fuzzy internal schedule and rolled his cart into the back alley. The filth near the collection point made him grimace, but he approached the rabbit hutch ruin anyway. He crouched as if adjusting a rope on his cart, and his eyes flicked across the cracks. At first he saw nothing but snow, mud, and years of leaves turned to rot. He was about to leave when a reflection caught his attention. A small piece of white, far cleaner than its surroundings, edge sharp, wedged between dark soil and brick. With a gloved finger, he carefully pried it free, a pure white shard shaped like an arrowhead, clean, not like something long exposed. His pulse jumped. He teased aside nearby debris. Soon he found the blue cornflower patterned piece and, deeper, the heavy base shard. 3 pieces, different in texture and shape, yet all unusually clean, all tucked deep into the brickwork. Not accidental, deliberate. Jean-Noël did not know the code, but he remembered the instruction. Matched sets of clean, placed items mattered. He shoved the 3 shards inside his coat and pushed his cart away at the same slow pace as always. Later, at the edge of a small square arranged for exchanges, he handed the shards to the liaison, who always wore a gray overcoat and never spoke. Jean-Noël added, low, at location B7, the rabbit hutch code. 3 pieces, put there on purpose. The shards moved up a brittle, hidden chain. By themselves, they held no intelligence value. But their timing around the tightening ring on Bastogne, their location at a cold storage point, and their clear ordered set created a signal. At a surviving resistance analysis node, the shards were placed beside other scraps of reporting that would otherwise have been ignored. A farmer's note that heavy vehicles had left fresh ruts on a logging track at the edge of the eastern woods. A rail worker's remark about seeing unusual canvas-covered transport, unable to confirm the cargo. The shards could not be read directly, but they acted like a catalyst. They connected isolated low-credibility fragments into a single blurred region, the eastern woods. The decision that followed was hard and costly. Inside the Bastogne pocket, resistance capability itself was near collapse, and any active reconnaissance carried enormous risk. But what if the woods hit a German ammunition dump or a command node? In the end, a brief, highly encrypted warning, along with a request for a limited-risk secondary confirmation of the eastern woods, was forced through a clandestine radio chain not yet fully severed. After multiple relays, it reached an Allied intelligence unit behind the lines. They could not verify the source as fully reliable, but in a crisis as severe as Bastogne, any clue about German supply or deployment warranted scrutiny. Days later, an extremely low-altitude reconnaissance flight was approved, targeting the eastern woods edge. Eloise knew none of this. At the worst moment of the siege, the shelling came close enough to make the cafe's windows hum and shake dust from the ceiling. She and others, with nowhere to go, huddled in the cellar, listening to dull impacts overhead. She thought she would die there, buried with her secret. Strangely, when death felt near enough to touch, her anxiety about whether the signal had been received faded. She only gripped a smooth pebble in her pocket, a stone she had once picked up with her brother by the river long ago. It felt cold and solid. In late December 1944, on an unusually bitter morning, the east side of town erupted with a chain of muffled blasts, different from normal shelling. Firelight stained half the sky red for a long while. In the cellar, people stared at each other, guessing. A German logistics site hit, ammunition cooking off Allied bombing. The rumors were quickly swallowed by more urgent needs of survival. When Eloise climbed out, she saw more German soldiers in the streets. Faces tight, runners and signalmen rushing. The air carried a tension and unease. She watched without reaction. The explosions were too far away. Compared to hunger and cold, they were too vague. The encirclement finally broke in early January 1945. American forces advanced through snow and rubble into Bastogne. Cheers, tears, and a dizzying wave of relief swept the survivors. Eloise stood at the cafe door watching young, exhausted American soldiers hand out rations and medicine. Order began to return slowly. She kept working at the cafe. Her customers changed to Allied troops and locals returning from hiding. Life tried to climb back toward something like normal, yet she knew some things would never be the same. The secret still sat heavy in her. She never spoke of Peterson or the shards or the rabbit hutch to anyone. Not out of safety, occupation was over, but because she did not know how to begin or who to tell. It became a solitary fragment in her personal war memory, unprovable, disconnected. Like the shard she had thrown, it lost meaning outside its context. By late January, the Bastogne municipal authorities began recruiting helpers to sort the documents and ledgers left behind by war, trying to restore basic administration. Eloise volunteered, partly for the small pay and partly for a vague impulse to be near the record of events. The work site was a warehouse cleared for temporary use, filled with stacks of papers collected from the German command post, the ruined town hall, and elsewhere. Her task was simple and deadening: roughly sort seemingly trivial logistics slips, loss reports, and daily logs by date. It was there, on a bitter afternoon, that she opened a bundle of German documents whose edges were singed, the paper brittle. Her German was limited to everyday greetings and item names, so reading was slow. She sorted mechanically. December 1944, December 20th, December 25th. Her eye stopped on a form titled Provisional Material Loss Report. The date was December 29th, 1944. The unit was a logistics support company. The content was brief, full of abbreviations and military terms. She struggled through it. A few words surfaced clearly. East of town, temporary ammunition storage site, ignited for unknown reasons. Partial loss, no personnel casualties. December 29, 1944. Eloise's fingers went rigid. She had thrown the third shard around December 22nd or 23rd, about a week of difference. East, ammunition, ignition, loss. The warehouse had no heat. Cold knifed through everything. Yet Eloise felt a different tremor rise from the base of her spine and spread slowly through her body. She stared at the report for a long time. The German letters swam and blurred, then pulled back into focus. She did not leap up, did not hunt for more proof, did not try to announce anything. A deep, submerged calm, mixed with an inexpressible sorrow, washed over her. She laid the report gently on the December 1944 stack, as carefully as if she were setting down a fragile piece of china. Then she moved on to the next document. Outside, Bastogne sky was still overcast, but the snow had stopped. In the distance came the tapping of reconstruction, rubble being cleared, walls being reset, the sound of a city trying to heal. She knew she would never be able to prove that the loss report had anything to do with her 3 porcelain shards. It could have been coincidence, an accident, or the result of other actions she would never learn about. Her signal might never have been received at all. The explosion might have been only one random spray of foam in war's turbulence. But proof was suddenly beside the point. In the darkest time, under the weight of a brutal wheel rolling over everything, she had chosen to believe in a childhood memory, rules for a game about broken porcelain and a rabbit hutch. She had used the only tools available to her, her routine, her memory, her solitude, to complete an encoding. Whether it was decoded correctly, whether it shifted any tiny balance in the field, she had made the throws. The shard she had carried was not a weapon and not a medal. It was only broken china with blue paint, a key she had turned against a door she might never see. The turn itself was enough to name her, even if the lock stayed silent. Spring came late to Bastogne, and it limped in. When the snow melted, it did not reveal the earth's original color, but mud, rubble, and the dark scars left by war. The café reopened using the same surviving cups and plates, many of them chipped. Eloise still washed them daily. The feel of water over her fingers was familiar and strange at once. More strangers filled the city, returning residents Allied engineers, investigators in different uniforms with serious faces, measuring, recording, asking questions among the ruins. The war seemed over, and yet it seemed to continue in another, slower, pettier form. One day, near the end of a shift at the temporary archives, a batch of documents she had sorted needed to be checked and sealed for storage. Among them appeared a few scattered reports from German logistics. Her eyes passed over them. She found no more references to an Eastern ammunition site. She stamped dates, placed pages into labeled boxes. As she was about to close the last folder, her fingers touched a sheet of thicker paper inside. She pulled it out and found a crude photocopy of a hand-drawn local map, clearly inserted later. The map labeled points in German. In one corner, several small rectangles were drawn beside the word Sammlungspunkt, collection point. Near one of those collection points was a very faint pencil mark, barely visible, shaped like a small, crooked rectangle without any label. Eloise stared at that small rectangle. Its location was the end of the back alley where she had dumped slops every day. Her heartbeat stayed even, her breathing steady. She knew what it was. The person who drew the map might have marked an irrelevant ruin by chance, or used it as a reference for deliveries. The map itself held no intelligence value, and the mark was no secret. Yet, to her, it became a quiet coordinate, a reminder that the rabbit hutch, the ruin she had used as a mailbox, had existed in the same plain world as these stamped pages and stored boxes. She slid the map back into the folder and closed it. The box was sealed with tape and loaded onto a cart bound for permanent archives. It would sleep alongside thousands of other boxes on a shelf deep in some archive room, perhaps never opened again. Eloise removed her apron and brushed dust from her hands. Outside, dusk was gathering. Far away, a church bell rang slow and heavy. A flock of pigeons swept over the rooftops toward their roosts, wings beating the air softly, full of life.